As the gavel fell on October 1st, 1946, the fate of 12 Nazi war criminals was sealed in the annals of history. The Nuremberg Trials, a series of military tribunals held in the wake of World War II, sought to bring to justice those responsible for the atrocities committed under Hitler's brutal regime. The defendants, once powerful figures in the Third Reich, now found themselves at the mercy of the International Military Tribunal. Among the condemned were Joachim von Ribbentrop, Alfred Rosenberg, Wilhelm Keitel, and Hermann Göring, the latter cheating the hangman's noose by taking his own life mere hours before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946. 10 others, however, would face the ultimate punishment for their crimes against humanity. As the night of October 16th descended, the condemned were led to the gallows erected in the gymnasium of Nuremberg's court prison. What became of their earthly remains after the sentences were carried out? Where were these notorious figures whose actions had plunged the world into the abyss of war and genocide laid to rest? In the words of Robert H. Jackson, Chief U.S. Prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. But what of the mortal remains of those who perpetrated these wrongs? Join us as we unravel the mystery surrounding the final resting places of the executed Nuremberg defendants, exploring the secretive journey their bodies undertook in the aftermath of their deaths. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. Facing justice, the notorious Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg. In the wake of World War II, as the world grappled with the unimaginable atrocities committed by Nazi Germany, the Allied powers sought to hold those responsible accountable for their actions. The Nuremberg Trials, which began on November 20th, 1945, brought some of the most notorious Nazi leaders to face justice before an international tribunal. Among these infamous figures were Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, each of whom played significant roles in the Third Reich's reign of terror. Hermann Göring, once considered Adolf Hitler's right-hand man and heir apparent, was perhaps the most prominent defendant at the Nuremberg Trials. Born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, Göring had a distinguished career as a fighter pilot during World War I, earning the prestigious Pour le Mérite, also known as the Blue Max. After the war, he joined the Nazi Party and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. As the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Göring played a crucial role in the German war effort, overseeing the development of the country's air force and the implementation of the Blitzkrieg tactics that led to early German victories. However, his reputation began to decline after the Battle of Britain in 1940, when the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over the United Kingdom. Despite this setback, Göring remained defiant, famously stating during the Nuremberg Trials, "The victor will always be the judge and the vanquished the accused." Throughout the war, Göring was also involved in the systematic looting of art and cultural treasures from occupied territories, amassing a vast personal collection. He was known for his extravagant lifestyle and flamboyant personality, once famously stating, "I decide who is a Jew." At the Nuremberg Trials, Göring was charged with conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Despite his attempts to defend his actions and challenge the authority of the tribunal, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. However, on the night before his scheduled execution, Göring eluded the Allies' final judgment by ingesting cyanide, denying them the chance to carry out the sentence. His final act of defiance was seen by many as a fitting end to a life marked by arrogance and a lust for power. Rudolf Hess, another high-ranking Nazi official, had a peculiar journey to the Nuremberg Trials. Born on April 26, 1894, in Alexandria, Egypt, Hess was an early member of the Nazi Party and served as Adolf Hitler's deputy from 1933 to 1941. He was known for his unwavering loyalty to Hitler and his involvement in the drafting of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped German Jews of their citizenship and civil rights. In May 1941, Hess made a surprising solo flight to Scotland, allegedly on a self-appointed mission to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom. He was immediately arrested by British authorities and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. This bizarre incident led to much speculation about Hess's motives and mental state, with some suggesting that he had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime and sought to end the war on his own terms. At the Nuremberg Trials, Hess was charged with conspiracy and crimes against peace. Throughout the proceedings, he displayed erratic behavior, claiming amnesia and often appearing disoriented. This led to speculation about his mental state and whether he was fit to stand trial. Despite his behavior, Hess was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served his sentence at Spandau Prison in West Berlin, where he remained the sole inmate from 1966 until his death in 1987 at the age of 93. His life and actions remain a subject of fascination and mystery to this day, with many historians and psychologists attempting to unravel the enigma of Rudolf Hess. As Winston Churchill once remarked, Hess is a medical and not a criminal case. He is a psychopathic case. He is a man who is mentally ill. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former German foreign minister, was another key figure on trial at Nuremberg. Born on April 30, 1893 in Wesel, Germany, Ribbentrop had a varied career before joining the Nazi Party. He worked as a businessman, a journalist, and even a champagne salesman before catching the eye of Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s. Ribbentrop's charm and social connections made him an attractive choice for Hitler, who appointed him as Germany's ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1936. In this role, Ribbentrop worked to improve relations between the two countries, but his efforts ultimately failed as tensions escalated in the lead-up to World War II. During his time in London, Ribbentrop gained a reputation for his pompous and arrogant behavior, with one British diplomat describing him as the most stupid and conceited man I have ever met. As the Nazi foreign minister from 1938 to 1945, Ribbentrop played a significant role in the diplomatic maneuverings that led to the outbreak of the war. He was instrumental in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union that allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. Ribbentrop also played a role in the deportation of Jews from occupied territories to concentration camps, signing agreements with countries such as Hungary and Romania to facilitate the transfer of Jewish populations. At the Nuremberg Trials, he was charged with conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Ribbentrop argued that he was merely following orders and that he had no knowledge of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. However, the tribunal found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. On October 16, 1946, Ribbentrop was executed, along with 9 other condemned Nazi leaders. In his final statement, he remained unrepentant, declaring, "I die believing in God and in my people." The birth of international justice, the London Charter, and the Nuremberg Trials. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was left reeling from the unimaginable atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. As the dust settled and the full extent of the horrors came to light, the Allied powers knew that swift action was necessary to bring those responsible to justice. The result was the creation of the International Military Tribunal and the birth of a new era in international law. As stated by Robert H. Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the United States at the Nuremberg Trials, "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility." The journey towards the Nuremberg Trials began on August 8, 1945, when representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union gathered in London to establish the legal framework for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. The outcome of this historic meeting, held at Church House in Westminster, was the London Charter, a groundbreaking document that laid the foundation for the International Military Tribunal and defined the crimes that would be tried at Nuremberg. The Charter was signed by the 4 Allied nations on August 8, 1945, marking a crucial step towards international justice. The London Charter was a marvel of legal innovation, born from the collective determination of the Allied powers to hold the perpetrators of the Holocaust and other wartime atrocities accountable for their actions. The Charter defined 3 main categories of crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This marked the first time in history that international law recognized the concept of crimes against humanity, a pivotal moment in the fight for global justice. As stated by Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, the British judge who presided over the Nuremberg trials, the charter of this tribunal evidences a faith that the law is not only to govern the conduct of little men, but that even rulers are, as Lord Chief Justice Coke put it to King James, under God and the law. One of the key figures behind the creation of the London Charter was Robert H. Jackson, an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, who was appointed by President Harry S. Truman to serve as the Chief Prosecutor for the United States at the Nuremberg Trials. Jackson played a crucial role in drafting the Charter and convincing his Allied counterparts of the importance of establishing a fair and impartial tribunal to try the Nazi leaders. In a memo to President Truman on June 6, 1945, Jackson wrote, "We must make clear to the Germans that the wrong for which their fallen leaders are on trial is not that they lost the war, but that they started it." In his opening statement at the Nuremberg trials on November 21, 1945, Jackson delivered a powerful message to the world, declaring, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." His words resonated with people around the globe, underscoring the significance of the trials and the necessity of holding the guilty parties accountable. This sentiment was echoed by Sir Hartley Shawcross, the Chief Prosecutor for the United Kingdom, who stated, "There are those who would perhaps say that these wretched men should have been dealt with summarily without trial by executive action, that their power for evil broken, they should have been swept aside into oblivion without this elaborate and careful investigation into the part which they played in bringing this war about." But that was not the view of the British government. The London Charter also established the structure and procedures of the International Military Tribunal, ensuring that the trials would be conducted with the utmost fairness and transparency. The tribunal was composed of one judge from each of the 4 Allied powers, with the requirement that all decisions be unanimous. This structure helped to maintain the integrity of the proceedings and prevent any one nation from exerting undue influence over the outcome. The judges chosen for the tribunal were Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, United Kingdom, Francis Biddle, United States, Henri Donnedieu de Vabres, France, and Iona Nikitchenko, Soviet Union. As the trials began on November 20, 1945, in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, the eyes of the world were fixed on the city. The defendants, who included high-ranking Nazi officials such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer, faced charges ranging from conspiracy to wage aggressive war to crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented a staggering array of evidence, including eyewitness testimony, documentary proof, and film footage of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the film Nazi concentration camps, which showed the horrific conditions and atrocities committed in the camps, leaving an indelible mark on all those who witnessed it. Throughout the trials, which lasted until October 1, 1946, the importance of the London Charter became increasingly clear. The Charter's definition of crimes against humanity allowed the prosecution to hold the defendants accountable for their roles in the Holocaust and other atrocities, even if they had not directly participated in the acts themselves. This principle of individual responsibility for international crimes was a groundbreaking development in international law and has since become a cornerstone of modern human rights law. As stated by Sir Hartley Shawcross in his closing statement, the charter of this tribunal has prescribed fair and just standards of conduct for the treatment of civilian populations. The German people in the territories occupied by them were entitled to the benefit of these standards. It is not the function of this tribunal to lay down standards of conduct for the Germans in the government of their own country, but we affirm that there are standards of decency and humanity which all peoples have a right to expect of those who hold power over them. As stated by Benjamin B. Ferencz, a prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, the Nuremberg Trials established that all of humanity would be guarded by an international legal shield, and that even a head of state would be held criminally responsible and punished for aggression and crimes against humanity. Nuremberg Trials, navigating uncharted legal territory in the pursuit of justice. As the world began to rebuild in the aftermath of World War II, the Allied powers faced an unprecedented challenge: how to bring the architects of the Nazi regime's atrocities to justice. However, the prosecution faced a significant legal hurdle in the form of the principle of ex post facto laws, which prohibits the retroactive application of criminal statutes. The question at the heart of this legal conundrum was whether the Nazi leaders could be held accountable for crimes that were not formally recognized under international law at the time they were committed. The atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime, including the systematic murder of millions of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and other targeted groups, as well as the waging of aggressive wars, had never been codified as crimes in any international treaty or convention. The magnitude of these crimes was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, an estimated 6 million Jews were murdered in concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Belzec, while countless others were subjected to forced labor, medical experimentation, and other forms of brutality. In his opening statement at the Nuremberg Trials, Justice Jackson eloquently articulated this idea, declaring, "The real complaining party at your bar is civilization. It is not necessary among the ruins of this ancient and beautiful city, with untold numbers of its civilian inhabitants still buried in its rubble, to argue the proposition that to start or wage an aggressive war has the moral qualities of the worst of crimes." Jackson's words resonated with the international community, which had borne witness to the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust and the destruction wrought by Nazi aggression. As he spoke, the courtroom was filled with a palpable sense of the historical significance of the moment, with journalists and observers from around the world hanging on every word. To bolster their case, the prosecution team at Nuremberg drew upon a range of legal precedents and moral arguments. They pointed to the Martins Clause, a provision in the preamble to the 1907 Hague Convention, which stipulated that in cases not covered by specific international agreements, the principles of the laws of humanity and the dictates of public conscience should apply. The prosecutors also invoked the concept of natural law, arguing that certain fundamental rights and prohibitions exist independently of any man-made legal system. As French prosecutor Auguste Champetier de Ribes declared in his opening statement on January 17, 1946, "The conscience of humanity, which is one and indivisible, was profoundly shocked by the crimes of National Socialism, and the universal conscience demands that these crimes be condemned and punished." Moreover, the Allied powers had already laid the groundwork for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals through a series of declarations and agreements. The Moscow Declaration of 1943, signed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, had stated that those responsible for atrocities would be brought back to the countries in which their crimes were committed and judged according to the laws of those nations. Despite these legal foundations, the defense attorneys at Nuremberg argued vehemently that the prosecution's case violated the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, which holds that an act cannot be considered a crime unless it was explicitly prohibited by law at the time it was committed. They contended that the charges against their clients were based on ex post facto laws, and that the Allies were engaging in victor's justice. In response, the prosecution maintained that the Nazi crimes were so heinous and contrary to the basic tenets of human morality that they transcended any legal technicalities. As British prosecutor Sir Hartley Shawcross declared in his closing statement on July 26, 1946, "There are, as I have said, some things which are not the subject of the law of any state, which the law of no state can justify. Murder, torture, genocide have long been crimes against the conscience of mankind." Shawcross's words echoed those of his American counterpart, Justice Jackson, who had argued in his opening statement that the defendants must be held responsible for the wicked and illegal program which they clearly knew and sanctioned. Ultimately, the Nuremberg Tribunal rejected the defense's arguments and found the Nazi leaders guilty of the charges against them. In its judgment, delivered on October 1, 1946, the tribunal stated, "Crimes against international law are committed by men, not by abstract entities, and only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced." This landmark decision established the principle of individual criminal responsibility for violations of international law, paving the way for future prosecutions of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, the British judge who presided over the Nuremberg trials, declared in his closing remarks, "The law is not static, but by continual adaptation follows the needs of a changing world." The Nuremberg trials, though not without their flaws and controversies, represented a watershed moment in the development of international criminal law. By confronting the legal challenges posed by the unprecedented nature of the Nazi atrocities, the Allied prosecutors and judges at Nuremberg helped to establish a new paradigm for holding individuals accountable for the most egregious violations of human rights. As Justice Jackson observed in his closing statement, the future will never have to ask, with misgiving, what could the Nazis have said in their favor? History will know that whatever could be said, they were allowed to say. They have been given the kind of a trial which they, in the days of their pomp and power, never gave to any man. From Nuremberg to The Hague, the legacy of the Nuremberg trials in shaping international law. One of the most significant legal principles to emerge from the Nuremberg trials was the concept of crimes against humanity. This groundbreaking idea, which had been championed by legal scholars such as Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin in the years leading up to the trials, held that certain acts were so egregious and morally reprehensible that they offended the very essence of human dignity and the collective conscience of mankind. Lauterpacht, a Polish Jewish lawyer who had fled to England in 1939, had written extensively on the concept of crimes against humanity in the early 1940s, arguing that such crimes shock the conscience of civilized humanity and demand international prosecution. Similarly, Lemkin, who had lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust, had coined the term genocide in 1944 to describe the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group. The Nuremberg Tribunal's acceptance of this argument and its subsequent conviction of the Nazi leaders on charges of crimes against humanity marked a watershed moment in the development of international criminal law. It established the principle that individuals could be held accountable for violations of international law, regardless of their official position or the laws of their own country. Among those convicted at Nuremberg were Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking Nazi official to be tried, who was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment and sentenced to death, and Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who was convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. The impact of the Nuremberg trials on international law was not limited to the immediate aftermath of World War II. The legal principles established at Nuremberg played a crucial role in the development of 2 of the most important international treaties of the 20th century, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 9, 1948, and the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which established the standards for the humane treatment of civilians and prisoners of war during armed conflicts. The Genocide Convention, which was adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly, defined genocide as any of 5 specific acts, including killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and forcibly transferring children committed with the intent to destroy a particular group. It also established the principle of universal jurisdiction, meaning that any country could prosecute individuals for genocide, regardless of where the crime had been committed or the nationality of the perpetrators or victims. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, which were adopted in the Swiss city of Geneva, also built upon the legal principles established at Nuremberg. The conventions, which were an update and expansion of earlier treaties governing the conduct of war, established the standards for the treatment of civilians, prisoners of war, and the wounded and sick during armed conflicts. They prohibited torture, summary executions, and other forms of mistreatment, and required that all individuals be treated humanely and with respect for their dignity. The Convention's emphasis on the humane treatment of individuals, regardless of their nationality or allegiance, echoed the Nuremberg Tribunal's assertion that there were certain fundamental rights and prohibitions that existed independently of any man-made legal system. As Jean Pictet, one of the leading drafters of the Geneva Conventions, later wrote, "The Geneva Conventions are not merely a set of legal rules, they are also a monument to human dignity, a veritable charter of mankind." The impact of the Nuremberg Trials and the legal principles they established can be seen in the work of international criminal tribunals and courts in the decades since. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, which was established by the United Nations Security Council in 1993 to prosecute those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, built upon the precedent set at Nuremberg. The ICTY's prosecution of individuals such as Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Serbia, and Radovan Karadzic, the former leader of the Bosnian Serbs, for their roles in the genocide and other atrocities committed during the wars, demonstrated the continued relevance and importance of the principles established at Nuremberg. As ICTY prosecutor Richard Goldstone noted in a 1995 speech, "The Nuremberg precedent has been followed, built upon, and expanded by the work of the ICTY." The message of Nuremberg and the ICTY is clear. Those who commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide will be held individually responsible for their acts. Similarly, the International Criminal Court, ICC, which was established by the Rome Statute in 1998 and began operations in 2002, owes a great deal to the legacy of Nuremberg. The ICC, which is based in The Hague, Netherlands, has jurisdiction over 4 main crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Its mandate is to prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community, and it has been involved in a number of high-profile cases, including the prosecution of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir for genocide and crimes against humanity in Darfur. As ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda said in a 2019 speech marking the 20th anniversary of the Rome Statute, the ICC is the embodiment of the Nuremberg legacy. It is a court of last resort, a court that steps in when national authorities are unable or unwilling to bring those most responsible for atrocity crimes to justice. The Nuremberg trials also had a profound impact on the development of international human rights law more broadly. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 10, 1948, was in many ways a response to the horrors of World War II and the atrocities prosecuted at Nuremberg. The Declaration's preamble, which states that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, echoes the language used by the Nuremberg prosecutors to describe the Nazi crimes against humanity. As Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the UN Commission on Human Rights that drafted the Declaration, later wrote, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in the shadow of the Holocaust and the Nuremberg Trials. It was an attempt to ensure that the horrors of World War II would never be repeated. The final chapter, the execution of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. As the sun rose over the war-torn city of Nuremberg on October 16, 1946, the world waited with bated breath for the final act of the historic Nuremberg Trials. Just hours earlier, in the early morning darkness, 10 of the most notorious Nazi war criminals had been led from their cells in the Nuremberg prison to a specially constructed gallows in the prison gymnasium. These men, once among the most powerful and feared figures in the Third Reich, now stood condemned to death for their roles in the atrocities of World War II. Their crimes, as established by the Nuremberg Tribunal, were among the most heinous in human history. Hans Frank, as the Governor-General of occupied Poland, had overseen the brutal suppression of the Polish people and the deportation of millions of Jews to the death camps. Wilhelm Frick, as the Minister of the Interior, had been instrumental in the implementation of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jews and other non-Aryans of their civil rights. Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, as the top military leaders of the Third Reich, had played key roles in the planning and execution of the Nazi wars of aggression. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, as the head of the Reich Security Main Office, had been responsible for the operations of the Gestapo and the concentration camps. Joachim von Ribbentrop, as the foreign minister, had helped to plan the Nazi invasions of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Alfred Rosenberg, as the minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, had overseen the brutal occupation of the Soviet Union and the Baltic states. Fritz Sauckel, as the plenipotentiary for labor allocation, had been responsible for the deportation of millions of civilians to Germany for forced labor. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, as the Reichskommissar for the Netherlands, had overseen the deportation of Dutch Jews to the death camps. And Julius Streicher, through his vicious propaganda, had helped to incite the hatred and violence that fueled the Holocaust. As the condemned men were led to the gallows, one by one, they faced a scene that was both somber and surreal. The prison gymnasium had been transformed into a makeshift execution chamber with a specially constructed gallows that had been designed to accommodate multiple hangings. The room was filled with Allied military personnel, journalists, and a handful of witnesses, including some of the surviving victims of the Nazi regime. Among them was Sergeant John C. Woods, a US Army veteran who had been selected to serve as the hangman for the executions. The first to be executed was Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had been Hitler's foreign minister and a key architect of the Nazis' aggressive foreign policy. As he mounted the gallows, Ribbentrop turned to the assembled witnesses and declared, "God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My final wish is that Germany should recover her unity and that, for the sake of peace, there should be understanding between East and West." Moments later, the trapdoor swung open and Ribbentrop's lifeless body dangled from the end of the rope. Next to face the gallows was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the former chief of the German High Command. Keitel, who had been one of Hitler's most loyal and unquestioning subordinates, shouted "Heil Hitler!" as the black hood was placed over his head. After the executioner pulled the lever, a witness reported hearing a sharp, short, hysterical laugh, followed by the sound of the trapdoor banging open. Alfred Rosenberg, one of the chief ideologues of the Nazi movement, was the third to be executed. Rosenberg, who had been one of the most influential figures in the Nazi hierarchy, was also one of the most unrepentant. In his final statement, Rosenberg declared, "The Bolshevik pestilence will someday be eradicated forever. Today, I even warn the world democracies against this danger." Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the former head of the Reich Security Main Office, followed Rosenberg to the gallows. Kaltenbrunner, who had overseen the Gestapo and the concentration camps, was one of the most feared and hated members of the Nazi leadership. As he stood on the gallows, Kaltenbrunner remained defiant to the end, declaring, "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry this time my people were led by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." The remaining 6 condemned men followed in quick succession. Wilhelm Frick, the former Minister of the Interior, went to his death silently, offering no final statement. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the former Reichskommissar for the Netherlands, declared, "I hope that this execution is the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson taken from this World War will be that peace and understanding should exist between peoples. I believe in Germany." Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of occupied Poland, offered a lengthy final statement in which he accepted responsibility for his crimes and expressed remorse for his actions. "My conscience compels me to accept the just punishment for my many crimes," Frank said. "May God have mercy on my soul." Fritz Sorkel, the former plenipotentiary for labor allocation, and Alfred Jodl, the former chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, both remained silent as they faced the gallows. Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic publisher of Der Stürmer, went to his death shouting, "Heil Hitler!" and Purim Fest 1946, a reference to the Jewish holiday commemorating the deliverance of the Jews from a Persian plot to destroy them. By 2:45 a.m., the last of the condemned men had been hanged, and their bodies were cut down and placed in simple wooden coffins. The executions, which had been carried out with grim efficiency, marked the end of a long and painful chapter in world history. As news of the executions spread around the world, many saw them as a fitting and just end to the Nazi regime and its reign of terror. Others, however, questioned the wisdom and morality of the executions, arguing that they represented a form of victor's justice that set a dangerous precedent for the future. Ashes to ashes, the final disposition of the executed Nazi war criminals. In the early morning hours of October 16, 1946, the world witnessed the final act of justice at the Nuremberg Trials as 10 condemned Nazi war criminals were executed by hanging. As American journalist Joseph Kingsbury Smith, who witnessed the executions, later wrote, "Thus ended the lives of 10 men who had been the willing tools of Adolf Hitler, 10 men who had brought death and misery to millions of people." But what happened to the bodies of these infamous men after their execution? The answer lies in a series of events that unfolded in the hours and days following the hangings, a grim epilogue to the story of the Nuremberg Trials. American Army Colonel Burton C. Andrus, who had been in charge of the Nuremberg prison throughout the trials, was tasked with ensuring that the remains of the executed war criminals would be disposed of in a way that would prevent any possibility of veneration or memorialization by Nazi sympathizers. Immediately after the executions, the bodies of the 10 men were placed in simple wooden coffins and transported under heavy guard to a secret location outside of Nuremberg. There, they were met by a team of American soldiers who had been tasked with a macabre mission: to ensure that the remains of these notorious war criminals would never become objects of veneration or pilgrimage for Nazi sympathizers. Among the soldiers was Private First Class William F. Hess, who later recalled the surreal experience of driving through the bombed-out streets of Nuremberg with the coffins in the back of his truck. The solution they devised was as pragmatic as it was symbolic. The bodies would be cremated and their ashes scattered in a place where they could never be recovered or memorialized. The location chosen for this grim task was the Dachau concentration camp, located just outside of Munich. As U.S. Army chaplain Henry F. Gerecker, who administered to the condemned men in their final hours, later reflected, "It seemed a fitting place for the final act of the Nuremberg drama." Dachau had been one of the first and most notorious of the Nazi concentration camps, a place where tens of thousands of innocent people had been imprisoned, tortured, and killed during the Third Reich. It was a fitting final destination for the remains of the men who had helped to perpetrate these atrocities. As Kingsbury Smith wrote in his dispatch from Nuremberg, Dachau, where thousands of innocent people had died, would now receive the ashes of 10 of the most guilty. On the morning of October 17, 1946, the coffins containing the bodies of the executed war criminals were loaded onto a truck and driven the 200 kilometers from Nuremberg to Dachau. There, they were met by a group of American soldiers and a handful of German civilians who had been recruited to assist with the cremation process. Among them was Sergeant William Fackler, who had been a prisoner at Dachau during the war and had witnessed firsthand the atrocities committed there. One of those civilians was a man named Heinrich Bollmann, who had worked as a stoker at the Dachau crematorium during the war. Bollmann had been forced to assist with the disposal of the bodies of countless concentration camp victims, a traumatic experience that had left him deeply scarred. Now he found himself once again standing in front of the crematorium ovens, this time preparing to dispose of the remains of the men who had been responsible for so much suffering and death. As Bollmann later told an interviewer, it was a strange feeling to be burning the bodies of the men who had caused so much harm. As Bollmann and the other workers prepared the ovens, the American soldiers carefully removed the bodies from the coffins and placed them on the conveyor belt that would carry them into the flames. One by one, the corpses of the 10 executed war criminals were fed into the ovens, their flesh and bones quickly consumed by the searing heat. Private First Class John Dolibois, who had served as an interpreter at the Nuremberg Trials, later described the scene as surreal and haunting. The process took several hours as the soldiers and workers methodically fed the bodies into the ovens and sifted through the ashes to ensure that no recognizable remains were left behind. When the last of the bodies had been cremated, the soldiers gathered up the ashes and prepared to dispose of them in a way that would ensure they could never be recovered or venerated. As Kingsbury Smith wrote, the dust of the 10 Nazi leaders was placed in an army truck and driven away, destination unknown. The decision was made to scatter the ashes in the Isar River, a fast-moving waterway that runs through Munich and empties into the Danube. On the morning of October 18, 1946, a small group of American soldiers drove to a secluded spot along the banks of the river, where they carefully poured the ashes of the 10 executed war criminals into the swirling waters. As one of the soldiers later recalled, "We watched as the ashes disappeared into the current, carried away by the force of the river. It was a moment of profound silence and reflection. As the ashes disappeared into the current, carried away by the force of the river, one of the soldiers later recalled feeling a sense of finality and justice. It was like a weight had been lifted from our shoulders," he said. "These men had caused so much suffering and death, and now they were gone, scattered to the winds like the ashes of their victims." For many, the scattering of the ashes in the Isar River represented a final act of justice, a way of ensuring that the names and deeds of these notorious war criminals would be forgotten and their remains would never become objects of veneration. As Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, a prominent Jewish leader who had been a vocal advocate for the prosecution of Nazi war crimes, later wrote, "The scattering of the ashes in the Isar River was a fitting end to the story of the Nuremberg Trials. It was a reminder that justice had been served and that the world would never forget the crimes of the Nazi regime." In the years that followed, the story of the Nuremberg executions and the disposal of the bodies became a topic of fascination and controversy. Some questioned the decision to deny the condemned men a proper burial, arguing that it was a violation of basic human rights. Others saw it as a fitting and just end to a regime that had shown no mercy to its victims. As U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who had served as the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, later wrote, "The record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well." Inside the Minds of Evil, Gustave Gilbert's psychological profiles of the Nuremberg defendants. As the Nuremberg trials unfolded in the war-torn city of Nuremberg, Germany, in 1945 and 1946, the world watched in horror as the full extent of the Nazi atrocities was laid bare. But amidst the harrowing testimony and damning evidence, one man sought to understand the minds behind the madness. His name was Gustave Gilbert, and his groundbreaking work as a prison psychologist would provide an unprecedented glimpse into the psyches of some of history's most notorious war criminals. As the renowned psychiatrist Karl Menninger once said, "The voice of intelligence is drowned out by the roar of fear. It is ignored by the voice of desire. It is contradicted by the voice of shame. It is biased by hate and extinguished by anger. Most of all, it is silenced by ignorance." Born in New York City in 1911, Gustave Gilbert was a young man with a keen intellect and a fascination with the human mind. After earning his PhD in psychology from Columbia University in 1939, Gilbert joined the US Army and was assigned to the Nuremberg Trials as a prison psychologist. His task was to evaluate the mental fitness of the defendants and to provide psychological support to the American guards and prosecutors. Gilbert's expertise in the field of psychology was highly regarded, and he had previously worked with the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, conducting psychological assessments of Nazi leaders. But Gilbert saw an opportunity to do much more than that. He recognized that the Nuremberg trials presented a unique chance to study the psychology of evil, to understand what had driven these men to commit such heinous crimes. And so, over the course of the trials, Gilbert conducted extensive interviews with the defendants, probing their minds and recording their thoughts and emotions in meticulous detail. Gilbert's approach was groundbreaking at the time, as he sought to understand the defendants as individuals rather than simply as criminals. As he later wrote in his book, Nuremberg Diary, "In my work with the defendants, I was searching for the nature of evil, and I now think I've come close to defining it." The result of Gilbert's work was a series of psychological profiles that remain unparalleled in their depth and insight. Through his interviews, Gilbert was able to paint a vivid picture of the men who had orchestrated the Holocaust and plunged the world into war. He spoke with the likes of Hermann Göring, the former Reichsmarshal and second-in-command to Hitler, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office and a key architect of the final solution. Gilbert's interviews with these men took place in the Nuremberg prison, where the defendants were held during the trials. He spent countless hours with them, often late into the night, in an effort to understand their motivations and thought processes. Gilbert's interviews revealed a complex web of motivations and personality traits that had driven these men to commit their crimes. Some, like Göring, were driven by a lust for power and a belief in their own superiority. Others, like Hess, were true believers in the Nazi ideology, convinced that they were doing what was right for Germany. Still others, like Kaltenbrunner, were sadists who reveled in the suffering of others. Gilbert's profiles of these men were remarkably detailed and nuanced, capturing the complexities of their personalities and the twisted logic behind their actions. As he wrote of Göring, his ego, his need for recognition, his overwhelming sense of superiority, his contempt for mankind in general, made him a natural Nazi. One of the most striking themes that emerged from Gilbert's interviews was the defendants' lack of remorse for their actions. Many of them, even when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of their guilt, remained defiant and unrepentant. Göring, for example, told Gilbert that he had no regrets about his role in the Nazi regime. "I would do it all over again," he said. "The only mistake I made was that I lost." This lack of remorse was a common thread among the defendants, and Gilbert saw it as a key indicator of their psychopathology, as he wrote in Nuremberg Diary, "Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy." But perhaps the most chilling insight that Gilbert gleaned from his interviews was the realization that these men were not monsters, but rather ordinary human beings who had been swept up in a monstrous ideology. As he wrote in his book, Nuremberg Diary, which was published in 1947 and became a bestseller, "In my work with the defendants, I was searching for the nature of evil, and I now think I have come close to defining it. A lack of empathy. It's the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow men." This insight was particularly troubling for Gilbert, as it suggested that the capacity for evil lay within all of us. As he later reflected, the disturbing thing about the Nuremberg trials was not that the defendants were monsters, but that they were, by and large, ordinary men. Gilbert's work at Nuremberg was not without its critics. Some accused him of being too sympathetic to the defendants, of trying to understand their actions rather than condemn them. But Gilbert remained steadfast in his belief that understanding the psychology of evil was essential to preventing it from happening again. "We must try to understand these men," he wrote, "not to excuse them, but to be forewarned and forearmed against the recurrence of such evil." Gilbert's approach was controversial at the time, but it has since become a cornerstone of modern psychology. As the renowned psychologist Philip Zimbardo once said, "Evil is the exercise of power, and that's the key, it's about power. To intentionally harm people psychologically, to hurt people physically, to destroy people mortally, or ideas, and to commit crimes against humanity." Gilbert's insights into the minds of the Nuremberg defendants continue to resonate today, more than 70 years after the trials ended. His work laid the foundation for the field of political psychology and inspired generations of researchers to study the roots of genocide and mass violence. And his message of empathy and understanding, even in the face of unspeakable evil, remains as relevant as ever in a world still grappling with the legacy of the Holocaust. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the Nuremberg trials for The New Yorker, once wrote, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." As Gilbert himself wrote in the final pages of Nuremberg Diary, "The Nuremberg trials have shown me two faces of evil, the evil of those who planned this crime against humanity and the evil of the world that stood by complacently while it was being planned. One form of evil may be vanquished by force of arms, the other can be vanquished only by a rededication of man to man." The paper trail of evil, the monumental task of gathering evidence for the Nuremberg trials. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world grappled with the horrific crimes committed by the Nazi regime, a group of determined prosecutors and investigators embarked on a monumental task to gather the evidence needed to bring the perpetrators to justice. As the American journalist and war correspondent Martha Gellhorn observed, "The Nuremberg trials are the most significant tribute that power has ever paid to reason." At the heart of the prosecution's case was a staggering array of evidence and documentation, meticulously gathered from the ruins of the Third Reich. The task of collecting and organizing this material fell to a team of dedicated investigators, led by the indefatigable Robert H. Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the United States. Jackson, a former Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice, had been personally appointed by President Harry S. Truman to lead the American prosecution team, and he quickly set about assembling a crack team of lawyers, investigators, and translators to help him build the case against the Nazi defendants. Among them was the brilliant young lawyer Whitney R. Harris, who would later go on to write a definitive account of the trials, Tyranny on Trial. One of the most important sources of evidence for the prosecution was the vast trove of Nazi documents and records that had been seized by Allied forces in the final months of the war. These included everything from official government records and military orders to personal diaries and correspondence, and they provided a chilling insight into the inner workings of the Nazi regime. Among the most damning documents presented at the trials were the Wannsee Protocol, which outlined the Nazis' plans for the final solution, and the Posen speeches, in which Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, openly acknowledged the mass murder of the Jews. Among the most damning pieces of evidence presented at the trials were the meticulously kept records of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units responsible for the murders of over 1 million Jews and other civilians in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. These records, which included detailed reports on the number of people killed and the methods used, provided a clear and unequivocal record of the Nazis' genocidal policies. As Benjamin Ferencz, one of the prosecutors at the Einsatzgruppen trial, later recalled, the reports were so detailed, so clear, so damning, that there was no possibility of denial. Ferencz, who was just 27 years old at the time, had been tasked with reviewing the Einsatzgruppen reports and presenting them as evidence at the trials. He would later go on to become a leading advocate for international criminal law and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Another key source of evidence for the prosecution was the vast collection of film footage and photographs documenting the atrocities committed by the Nazis. This included both official propaganda films and footage shot by Allied soldiers as they liberated the concentration camps, and it provided a visceral and unforgettable record of the horrors of the Holocaust. As Jackson noted in his closing statement, the photographic evidence in particular leaves nothing to imagination or speculation. These captured German films reveal, more graphically than words can describe, what the Nazis did to those they considered their inferiors. Among the most powerful pieces of film evidence presented at the trials was the footage shot by the British filmmaker Sidney Bernstein, who had been commissioned by the Allied forces to document the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945. The task of presenting this evidence in court fell to a team of skilled prosecutors who worked tirelessly to build a compelling case against the Nazi defendants. Among them was Thomas Dodd, a young lawyer from Connecticut who had been recruited by Jackson to join the prosecution team. Dodd, who would later go on to serve as a US senator, was tasked with presenting evidence related to the Nazis' aggressive war-making and the atrocities committed in the concentration camps. In a powerful moment during the trials, Dodd presented a film compilation of footage from the liberated camps, showing the emaciated bodies of the prisoners and the piles of corpses left behind by the retreating Germans. As he later recalled, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of the projector. It was the most devastating moment of the trial. Dodd's presentation of the film evidence was so powerful that it moved even some of the most hardened Nazi defendants to tears. The impact of this evidence on the defendants was profound. Many of them, who had previously maintained their innocence or claimed to have been unaware of the atrocities committed by the regime, were confronted with the incontrovertible proof of their guilt. As Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of occupied Poland, later confessed to the prison psychologist Gustave Gilbert, "I didn't know about the exterminations, but I knew horrible things were happening. I should have known more, and I should have done something about it. That is my guilt." Frank, who had been one of Hitler's closest associates and a key architect of the Nazi occupation of Poland, was ultimately sentenced to death by the Nuremberg Tribunal. As Jackson noted in his closing statement, "If we cannot eliminate the causes and prevent the repetition of these barbaric events, it is not an irresponsible prophecy to say that this 20th century may yet succeed in bringing the doom of civilization." The evidence and documentation presented at the trials, much of it now preserved in archives and museums around the world, stands as a testament to the courage and determination of those who worked to bring the perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice. As Ferenc, who went on to become a leading advocate for international criminal law, once said, "There can be no peace without justice, no justice without law, and no meaningful law without a court to decide what is just and lawful under any given circumstance." The Shadows of Nuremberg. Descendants grapple with a dark family legacy. The Nuremberg Trials, as they came to be known, saw the prosecution of high-ranking Nazi officials for their roles in the atrocities committed during World War II. But what became of the families of these men, the descendants who were left to grapple with the dark legacy of their ancestors? As the philosopher George Santayana famously warned, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. For many of these descendants, the shadow of Nuremberg has been a constant presence in their lives. They have had to come to terms with the fact that their grandfathers, fathers, or uncles were responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in human history. Some have chosen to speak out about their family's past, while others have preferred to remain silent, hoping to distance themselves from the sins of their forebears. One such descendant is Katrin Himmler, the great niece of Heinrich Himmler, the infamous head of the SS and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. In her 2007 book, The Himmler Brothers, A German Family History, Katrin delves into the lives of her great-uncles and tries to understand how they could have become such monsters. "I want to understand how they became what they were," she writes. "I want to look at the entire picture, not just the years that are in the history books." One of the most prominent descendants to grapple with this legacy is Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who served as the Governor-General of occupied Poland during the war. Hans Frank was one of the most notorious defendants at Nuremberg and was ultimately sentenced to death for his role in the extermination of millions of Jews and Poles. Nicholas Frank, who was born in 1939, has spent much of his life trying to come to terms with his father's crimes. In a series of books and interviews, he has spoken candidly about his struggle to reconcile his love for his father with the knowledge of his monstrous deeds. "I have never been able to hate my father," he once said, "but I despise what he did." In his 1987 book, Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, The Father, A Settling of Accounts, Niklas delves deep into his father's life and tries to understand how he could have become such a monster. "I had to write this book," he says. "I had to try to understand my father, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of his soul." Another descendant who has grappled with this legacy is Bettina Göring, the great-niece of Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in the Nazi regime after Hitler himself. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death at Nuremberg, but circumvented his execution by causing his own demise the night before it was scheduled. Bettina Göring, who was born in 1956, has spoken publicly about the shame and guilt she feels over her family's past. In a 2006 documentary titled Bloodlines, she described how she had chosen to undergo voluntary sterilization to ensure that the Göring bloodline would end with her. "I cut the line," she said. "I don't want to pass on the blood of a monster." Bettina's decision to undergo sterilization was a deeply personal one, but it reflects the profound impact that the legacy of Nuremberg can have on those who are related to the defendants. "It's a heavy burden to carry," she says, "but it's one that I feel I have to bear for the sake of the victims and for the sake of future generations." But not all descendants of the Nuremberg defendants have been willing to confront their family's past so directly. Some, like Wolf Rudiger Hess, the son of Rudolf Hess, have sought to defend their ancestors and downplay their crimes. Rudolf Hess, who served as Hitler's deputy Führer until his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941, was sentenced to life in prison at Nuremberg. Wolf Rudiger Hess, who was born in 1937, spent much of his life campaigning for his father's release, arguing that he had been unfairly imprisoned and that the Nuremberg trials were a sham. "My father was a good man," he once said. "He was a victim of Victor's justice." Wolf Rudiger's efforts to defend his father's legacy have been controversial and have been met with criticism from those who see them as an attempt to whitewash the crimes of the Nazi regime. "It's a dangerous game to play," says the historian Guy Walters. "By trying to defend their ancestors, these descendants risk minimizing the terrible crimes that were committed in the name of the Third Reich." Other descendants have chosen to remain silent about their family's past, preferring to keep a low profile and avoid the scrutiny of the media. One such descendant is the grandson of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office and a key architect of the Holocaust. Kaltenbrunner was sentenced to death at Nuremberg and executed in 1946. His grandson, who has never been publicly identified, is said to have changed his name and moved to South America to escape the burden of his family's legacy. "It's a shame that he feels he has to hide," says the writer and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. "But I can understand why he might want to escape the shadow of his grandfather's crimes." As Nicholas Frank once said, "It is my duty to speak out, to tell the truth about my father and his crimes. It is the only way to ensure that such crimes are never repeated." And as the world continues to grapple with the legacy of the 20th century's darkest chapter, it is a duty that we all share, descendants and non-descendants alike. For as Elie Wiesel so powerfully reminds us, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. The Nuremberg epilogue, bringing the cogs of the Nazi machine to justice. In the years that followed, the Allied powers continued their quest for justice, pursuing those who had played key roles in the Nazi regime's heinous crimes. Between December 1946 and April 1949, a series of 12 trials were held in Nuremberg, each focusing on a different aspect of the Nazi apparatus. These trials, known collectively as the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, targeted a wide range of individuals, from doctors who had conducted horrific medical experiments on concentration camp inmates to industrialists who had profited from slave labor to military leaders who had carried out war crimes on the battlefield. In total, 185 defendants were tried, with 142 convicted and sentences ranging from a few years in prison to death by hanging. The trials were held in the same courtroom as the main trial, with many of the same prosecutors and judges presiding over the cases. As the journalist Martha Gellhorn observed, "The war is over, but the trials are not. The trials are a continuation of the war." One of the most infamous of these trials was the Doctors' Trial, which began on December 9, 1946, and ended on August 20, 1947. The defendants in this case were 23 physicians and administrators who had been involved in the Nazi regime's brutal medical experiments on prisoners, including forced sterilization, exposure to extreme temperatures, and the testing of experimental drugs. The chief prosecutor in the case, Brigadier General Telford Taylor, described the defendants as monsters in human form and argued that their crimes had brought shame upon the honorable profession of medicine. Among the most notorious of the defendants was Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the head of the Nazi euthanasia program, who was accused of overseeing the murder of more than 300,000 disabled and mentally ill people. In his defense, Brandt claimed that he was simply following orders and that the euthanasia program was a mercy killing of those deemed unfit to live. The tribunal rejected this argument, with one judge declaring that a law which is basically inhumane and contrary to natural law is not a law at all. In the end, 16 of the defendants were found guilty, with 7 sentenced to death and the others receiving lengthy prison terms. Another notable trial was the Flick trial, which concerned the actions of Friedrich Flick and 5 other industrialists who had been involved in the Nazi regime's slave labor program. Flick, who had been one of Germany's richest men before the war, was accused of using concentration camp inmates and prisoners of war as forced laborers in his factories, subjecting them to brutal working conditions and contributing to the deaths of thousands. In his opening statement, prosecutor Charles Lafollette declared that the guilt of these men is as black as the coal they mined and as foul as the smoke from their furnaces. The trial, which lasted from April to December 1947, was notable for the complex legal questions it raised about the responsibility of industrialists for the crimes of the Nazi regime. In the end, Flick and 2 of his co-defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2.5 to 7 years, while the other 3 defendants were acquitted. The relatively lenient sentences were a source of controversy, with some critics arguing that the defendants had gotten off too easily for their role in the Nazi war machine. Perhaps the most famous of the subsequent Nuremberg trials was the Einsatzgruppen trial, which focused on the actions of the notorious SS death squads that had carried out mass killings of Jews, Romani people, and other undesirables in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. The 24 defendants in the case, many of whom had held high-ranking positions in the SS, were accused of overseeing the murder of more than 1 million people. The trial, which lasted from September 1947 to April 1948, was notable for the gruesomely detailed evidence presented by the prosecution, including eyewitness testimony from survivors and photographs of mass graves and execution sites. In his closing argument, prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz, who was just 27 years old at the time, declared that these men wrote the blackest page in human history and urged the court to affirm the supremacy of law over such lawless and inhuman savagery. All of the defendants were found guilty, with 14 sentenced to death and the others receiving lengthy prison terms. In defense of the indefensible, the Nuremberg Trials through the eyes of the accused. For the defense lawyers tasked with representing these men, the challenges were immense. How does one defend the actions of those accused of some of the most heinous crimes in human history? What legal strategies can be employed when the evidence of guilt seems overwhelming? These were the questions that the Nuremberg defense team grappled with as they prepared to make their case before the tribunal. The team was made up of a diverse group of lawyers from Germany, the United States, and other allied nations, each with their own legal backgrounds and political views. Some, like the American lawyer Douglas T. Bates, Jr., had volunteered for the job out of a sense of professional duty, while others, like the German lawyer Alfred Seidel, had been appointed by the court. One of the key figures on the defense team was Otto Kranzbühler, a German naval judge who had been assigned to represent Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy. Kranzbühler, like many of his colleagues, viewed his role not as defending the actions of his client, but rather as ensuring that the trial was conducted fairly and in accordance with international law. In his opening statement, Kranzbühler declared, "I am not here to defend the National Socialist regime. I am here to defend Admiral Dönitz against the accusations raised against him and to ensure that he receives a fair trial." This sentiment was echoed by other defense lawyers, such as the American lawyer Warren McGee, who represented the Nazi propagandist Hans Fritzsche. "The world is watching this trial," McGee declared, "and it is our duty to show that justice can be done even in the most difficult of circumstances." This sentiment was echoed by many of the other defense lawyers, who saw their role as upholding the principles of due process and the rule of law, even in the face of overwhelming public sentiment against their clients. As the American lawyer Charles La Follette, who represented the industrialist Friedrich Flick, put it, "The defense has a duty to present every argument and every piece of evidence that may help its client, no matter how unpopular or unpalatable those arguments may be." La Follette's client, Flick, was accused of using slave labor in his factories and profiting from the Nazi regime's war efforts. In his defense, La Follette argued that Flick had no choice but to cooperate with the regime, and that he had actually worked to improve conditions for his workers. This argument, while ultimately unsuccessful, highlighted the difficult position that many German industrialists found themselves in during the war. One of the primary strategies employed by the defense was to argue that their clients were simply following orders and acting in accordance with the laws and customs of war. This superior orders defense, as it came to be known, was based on the idea that soldiers and officers could not be held criminally responsible for carrying out the commands of their superiors, even if those commands were illegal or unethical. The defense team argued that the defendants, many of whom were military men, had been trained to obey orders without question and could not be expected to have known that their actions were criminal. This argument was used by the lawyer Hans Lartenser, who represented several of the military defendants, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl. Lartenser argued that his clients had been acting under the orders of Hitler and the Nazi leadership and could not be held responsible for their actions. This argument was met with skepticism by the prosecution and the judges, who pointed out that the defendants were not mere foot soldiers, but rather high-ranking officials with the power and authority to shape policy and make decisions. As the British prosecutor Hartley Shawcross declared in his closing statement, the defendants were the men in the inner councils, the men who planned and plotted, the men who gave the orders. They cannot now escape responsibility by saying that they were only obeying orders. Shawcross went on to argue that the defense of superior orders had been rejected by international law, citing the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which established the principle that soldiers could be held responsible for war crimes, even if they were acting under orders. Another defense strategy was to challenge the jurisdiction and legitimacy of the IMT itself. The defendants and their lawyers argued that the tribunal was a form of victor's justice, with the Allied powers sitting in judgment over their defeated enemies. They pointed out that many of the crimes the defendants were accused of, such as waging aggressive war and committing crimes against humanity, were not explicitly prohibited by international law at the time they were committed. As Hermann Göring, one of the most prominent defendants, declared in his testimony before the tribunal, the victor will always be the judge and the vanquished the accused. Göring, who had been Hitler's designated successor and the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, argued that the Allies had committed similar acts during the war, such as the bombing of civilian populations, and that the defendants were being held to a double standard. This argument, while legally complex, did little to sway the opinions of the judges or the public. The horrors of the Holocaust and the other atrocities committed by the Nazi regime were too fresh in the minds of the world for legal technicalities to carry much weight. As the American judge Francis Biddle observed in his final judgment, "The law is not a game, and war criminals cannot escape punishment by invoking technical defenses." Biddle went on to argue that the crimes committed by the Nazi regime were so egregious that they violated the fundamental principles of international law and human rights, regardless of whether they were explicitly prohibited by existing treaties or conventions. Despite the best efforts of the defense team, the Nuremberg trials ended with the conviction of 19 of the 24 defendants, with 12 sentenced to death by hanging. The other defendants received lengthy prison sentences, with some, like Rudolf Hess and Erich Raeder, serving life terms. As the American prosecutor Telford Taylor declared in his closing statement, "The defendants are not the only ones on trial here. The conscience of the world is on trial, and the world is watching to see if we can rise to the challenge of holding accountable those who have committed the most heinous crimes against humanity." For the defense lawyers who had represented the accused, the end of the trials brought a sense of relief and, in some cases, a degree of soul-searching. Many had taken on the task out of a sense of professional duty, believing that even the most reviled defendants deserved a fair trial and competent legal representation. Others, like the German lawyer Hans Lattenser, who had represented several of the military defendants, saw their role as a form of patriotic service, an attempt to salvage some measure of dignity and honor for their defeated nation. As Lattenser wrote in his memoirs, "I did not defend the Nazi regime or its crimes. I defended the honor of the German soldier who had fought bravely and loyally for his country, even if the cause he served was ultimately a lost one." Bearing witness, the voices of victims and survivors at Nuremberg. As the world watched the Nuremberg trials unfold from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, the voices of those who had suffered under the brutal Nazi regime began to emerge from the shadows. For the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and Nazi aggression, the trials represented a chance to bear witness to the atrocities they had endured and to seek some measure of justice for their losses. One of the first victims to take the stand was Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a French resistance fighter who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück concentration camps. On January 28, 1946, Vaillant-Couturier testified before the International Military Tribunal, describing in harrowing detail the conditions she and other prisoners had endured. "We were beaten, we were kicked, we were spat upon," she recalled, her voice trembling with emotion. "We were no longer human beings, we were numbers." Vaillant-Couturier's testimony, which lasted for several hours, was a searing indictment of the Nazi regime's brutality and a powerful reminder of the human toll of the Holocaust. She spoke of the gas chambers, the crematoria, and the medical experiments conducted on prisoners, her words painting a vivid picture of the unimaginable suffering endured by those imprisoned in the camps. Other survivors, such as the Polish Jew Rudolf Hess, who had escaped from Auschwitz in 1944 and written a detailed report on the camp's atrocities, also took the stand at Nuremberg. Wöber's testimony, given on April 16, 1946, was a chilling account of the systematic murder of Jews and other prisoners at the camp. The gas chambers themselves were camouflaged to resemble shower rooms, Hess told the court, his voice steady, but his eyes haunted by the memories. The unsuspecting victims were led into these rooms, and the doors were sealed behind them. Then the gas was turned on, and within a few minutes they were all dead. Verber's testimony, along with that of other survivors, such as the Slovakian Jew Alfred Wetzler and the French resistance fighter Maurice Lamper, helped to expose the full extent of the Nazi death machine and the complicity of those who had carried out its orders. As VRBA later wrote in his memoir, "I escaped from Auschwitz. I wanted the world to know what had happened, so that it could never happen again." For many survivors, the act of testifying at Nuremberg was a deeply traumatic experience, forcing them to relive the horrors they had witnessed and endured. The Polish Jew Sewerina Szmaglewskaja, who had survived the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, broke down in tears several times during her testimony on February 27, 1946. "I am very sorry," she told the court, struggling to compose herself, "but I have seen so much that my nerves are shattered." Despite the emotional toll, however, many survivors felt a profound sense of obligation to speak out, to ensure that the world would never forget the crimes of the Nazi regime. As the French resistance fighter Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier declared in her testimony, "It is necessary that the world knows what happened, so that it never happens again." This sentiment was echoed by many other survivors, such as the Italian Jewish writer Primo Levi, who later wrote in his memoir Survival in Auschwitz, "It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." As the American journalist and war correspondent Martha Gellhorn observed in her dispatches from Nuremberg, "The witnesses who have appeared before the tribunal have been the most dramatic and unforgettable part of the trial. They have made the horrors of the concentration camps real and present to the court and to the world." The testimonies of survivors such as Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, Rudolf Hess, and Sewerina Szmaglewskaja would go on to become some of the most widely cited and influential accounts of the Holocaust, shaping public understanding of the Nazi era for generations to come. For many survivors, the Nuremberg trials represented a crucial first step in the long and painful process of healing and rebuilding their lives. The knowledge that their tormentors were being held accountable for their crimes, even if the punishments could never truly fit the scope of their offenses, provided a sense of closure and vindication. As the Polish Jewish survivor and writer Primo Levi observed in his memoir, The Truce, the trial ended with the death sentence for the main defendants. It was a symbolic and perhaps necessary act, but it could not heal the wounds or bring back the dead. For Levi and many other survivors, the true legacy of Nuremberg lay not in the sentences handed down by the tribunal, but in the act of bearing witness itself. As Levi wrote in his final book, The Drowned and the Saved, the memory of the offense must not be allowed to fade. It must be kept alive so that it can serve as a warning for future generations. At the same time, however, many survivors and victims' families felt that the Nuremberg trials had not gone far enough in delivering justice for the crimes of the Nazi regime. The fact that many lower-level perpetrators and collaborators had escaped prosecution and that some of the defendants had received relatively lenient sentences was a source of frustration and anger for many. As the German Jewish survivor and writer Ruth Kluger observed in her memoir Still Alive, the trials were a beginning, but they were not enough. They could not bring back the dead or undo the damage that had been done. This sentiment was shared by many other survivors, such as the Austrian Jewish writer Jean Amery, who argued in his book At the Mind's Limits that the trials had failed to truly confront the moral and philosophical implications of the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials, Amery wrote, were a necessary but insufficient attempt to come to terms with the past. The Nuremberg trials, a legacy of justice or a case of victor's vengeance. The trials, which took place in the war-ravaged city of Nuremberg, Germany, were intended to hold the perpetrators of Nazi atrocities accountable for their actions and to establish a new framework for the prosecution of international crimes. However, despite their historic significance, the Nuremberg trials were not without their controversies and criticisms, which continue to be debated by legal scholars, historians, and the public to this day. One of the most persistent criticisms of the Nuremberg trials is that they represented a form of victor's justice, with the Allied powers sitting in judgment over their defeated enemies. Critics argue that the trials were politically motivated and that the defendants were not given a fair and impartial hearing. The fact that the Soviet Union, which had committed its own share of atrocities during the war, was one of the four powers sitting in judgment at Nuremberg, only added to the perception of hypocrisy and double standards. As the German writer and philosopher Hannah Arendt observed in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, the Nuremberg trials had shown the world that the vanquished could be tried by the victors. This sentiment was echoed by the German defense attorney Hermann Göring, who argued during the trials that might makes right and that the Allies were using the trials to impose their own brand of justice on the defeated Germans. Another point of contention surrounding the Nuremberg trials was the exclusion of crimes committed by the Allies during the war. While the IMT Charter did include provisions for the prosecution of war crimes committed by all sides, in practice, only crimes committed by the Axis powers were brought before the tribunal. This led to accusations of selective justice and a failure to hold the Allies accountable for their own misdeeds, such as the bombing of civilian populations and the mistreatment of prisoners of war. As the American historian Peter Maguire observed in his book Law and War, the Nuremberg trials were a necessary and important step in the development of international law, but they were also a product of their time and place, shaped by the political realities of the post-war world. For example, the Soviet Union's own war crimes, such as the Katyn massacre of Polish prisoners of war in 1940, were not addressed at Nuremberg, despite evidence of their occurrence. The legal precedents set by the Nuremberg trials have also been a source of controversy and debate. The IMT Charter introduced new concepts such as crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, which had not previously been recognized under international law. While these concepts have since become widely accepted and have been incorporated into the statutes of modern international criminal tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court, they were not universally accepted at the time of the Nuremberg trials. Some legal scholars argued that the retroactive application of these new crimes violated the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without law, and amounted to ex post facto law. As the American legal scholar and Nuremberg prosecutor Telford Taylor acknowledged in his book, The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials, the charge of ex post facto law was the most troublesome of the defense arguments. This criticism was also raised by the German defense attorney Otto Kranzbühler, who argued that the Nuremberg trials were a form of victor's justice, and that the defendants were being held accountable for crimes that did not exist under international law at the time they were committed. Despite these criticisms and controversies, however, the Nuremberg trials remain a landmark moment in the history of international criminal justice and human rights. They established the principle that individuals, no matter how powerful or influential, could be held accountable for crimes against humanity and other serious violations of international law. They also set important legal precedents and helped to lay the foundation for the development of modern international criminal law. As we delve into the twilight of our exploration, where the shadows of the Nuremberg trials stretch long and deep across the annals of history, we are reminded that from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, the world watched as justice sought to mend the fabric torn by war's cruel hands. In the heart of a shattered Nuremberg, names like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess faced the reckoning of a world aggrieved. Through these trials, a phoenix rose from the ashes of conflict, birthing the principles of international law that guide us even today. We learned that accountability is the golden thread in the tapestry of peace, a lesson engraved in the corridors of time. Let us part with a quote that echoes through the ages, from Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. As the gavel of history strikes, It resonates with the promise of justice, a beacon of hope in the dark. With that, we bid you farewell, not goodbye, as the legacy of Nuremberg is immortal, a constant guide on our journey towards a world embraced by the arms of justice and peace. Until we meet again in the quest for knowledge, may we all carry forward the torch of accountability and humanity, illuminated by the lessons of the past.